June 15, 1944. The island of Saipan. Dawn breaks over the turquoise waters of the Philippine Sea, but the light brings no comfort. The air tastes of salt and cordite. Smoke from naval bombardment drifts across volcanic rock and sugarcane fields like a funeral shroud. On the beaches, American landing craft grind against coral reefs, their metal ramps dropping with thunderous clangs. Marines wade through chest-deep water, rifles held high, while Japanese artillery screams down from the highlands. The invasion has begun, but this battle will not be won by bullets alone. It will be decided by something far more dangerous than firepower, by the collision of two opposing beliefs about what it means to be human. The soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army dug into Saipan's caves and cliffs had been told many things. They had been told that Americans were beasts, subhuman devils who tortured prisoners, desecrated the dead, and showed no mercy. They had been told that surrender meant dishonor worse than death, that their families would be shamed for generations, that the emperor himself would turn his sacred face away from their spirits. And they had been told, above all, that Japan could never lose. That the divine wind, the kamikaze, would rise again as it had 7 centuries before to sweep away the foreign invaders. That their sacrifice on this tiny island, 15 miles long and 7 miles wide, would be remembered in the annals of eternity as the moment when the tide of war turned back toward the rising sun. But by the summer of 1944, the tide was already turning away from Japan, away from the ideology that had sent millions of young men into the furnace of the Pacific War. Saipan was no isolated outpost. It was part of the Mariana Islands chain, close enough to the Japanese home islands that American B-29 bombers could reach Tokyo itself. Losing Saipan meant losing the war. Everyone knew it. The Japanese commanders knew it. The soldiers entrenched in the mountain caves knew it. And somewhere deep in their collective consciousness, beneath the layers of propaganda and indoctrination, they knew that the myths they had been fed were beginning to crack. The American Marines who stormed Saipan's beaches came from a different world entirely. Many were farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, fishermen from the Gulf Coast. They carried with them not just rifles and grenades, but chocolate bars, cigarette packs, letters from home, photographs of sweethearts. They chewed gum and complained about the heat and told jokes to keep their nerves steady. They had been told they were fighting for freedom, for democracy, for a world where ordinary people could live ordinary lives without fear of tyrants. To the Japanese defenders watching from the ridges above, these Americans seemed impossibly casual, impossibly confident, impossibly alive. And that confidence, that casual assumption of abundance and survival, would become the most terrifying weapon of all. The battle for Saipan lasted 24 days. It was a grinding, brutal campaign through dense jungle, across razor-sharp coral, up volcanic slopes where every cave concealed machine gun nests and every shadow might hide a soldier with a bayonet. The Japanese fought with ferocious discipline, launching banzai charges at midnight, screaming "Tenno Hika Banzai! Long live the Emperor!" as they threw themselves against American lines with swords, rifles, and sometimes nothing but sharpened bamboo stakes. The Marines had faced banzai charges before, on Tarawa and Guadalcanal, but never like this. Never with such desperation, such willingness to die not for tactical advantage, but for the act of dying itself. And yet, as the Americans advanced yard by bloody yard, something unexpected began to happen. Japanese soldiers who had been taught that capture meant torture found themselves treated according to the Geneva Conventions. Wounded prisoners received medical care, the same care given to wounded Marines. They were given water, food, cigarettes. American medics bandaged their wounds. Interpreters spoke to them gently, asking not for military secrets but for their names, their hometowns, whether they had families. For men who had been prepared for mutilation and death, this mercy was incomprehensible. Some wept. Some refused to believe it was real, convinced it was an elaborate trick. Others simply sat in silence, staring at the chocolate bar or the cigarette they had been handed, holding it like a religious artifact from an alien civilization. One captured Japanese officer, a lieutenant whose name was recorded in American intelligence reports as Yamaguchi, told his interrogators through tears that he had been ordered to shoot himself if captured. He had put his pistol to his temple 3 times. 3 times he had pulled the trigger. 3 times the gun had misfired. When the Marines found him, he was sitting beside a stream, holding the useless weapon, waiting to die. Instead, they gave him water. They bandaged the shrapnel wounds in his legs. They shared their rations with him, canned peaches, which he had not tasted since childhood. He asked them why. Why show kindness to an enemy? The Marine corporal who spoke a little Japanese shrugged and said, "Because the war will end someday, and when it does, we all have to go home." But not all Japanese soldiers could accept this reality. For many, the ideological cage they lived in was too strong, the fear of dishonor too great, the years of indoctrination too deep. As the American forces pushed north across Saipan, compressing the remaining Japanese defenders into the island's northern tip, a terrible choice crystallized. Surrender and live, but live as what? As traitors, as cowards, as men who had abandoned their duty to the emperor and their families, or refuse surrender, refuse capture, and die with honor intact. For thousands of soldiers, and for thousands of civilians who had been living on Saipan under Japanese rule, the answer seemed clear. Death was preferable to the unbearable shame of survival. By early July, the Japanese forces on Saipan had been shattered. The island's commander, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Sato, sent a final message to Tokyo. There is no hope for victory in places where we do not have control of the air. On July 6th, he committed ritual suicide in his cave headquarters, slicing open his abdomen in the traditional samurai fashion while an aide beheaded him. His death was the signal. That night, the remaining Japanese soldiers, perhaps 3,000 men, many of them wounded, starving, armed with nothing but bayonets or sharpened sticks, launched the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. They came in waves, screaming, stumbling, crawling. Some were drunk on sake that had been saved for this final moment. Others were silent, faces set in grim determination. They ran toward American machine gun positions with no hope of survival, no tactical objective except to die killing as many enemies as possible. The Americans, dug in behind sandbags and palm logs, fired until their gun barrels glowed red. The charge lasted 7 hours. When the sun rose on July 7th, the beaches and fields were carpeted with bodies. Nearly every Japanese soldier who participated was dead. They had achieved nothing except their own annihilation. But the true horror of Saipan was only beginning. At the northern end of the island, where the land drops away into cliffs that plunge 100 feet into the ocean, thousands of Japanese civilians had gathered. Men, women, children, families who had been living on Saipan for years, working in the sugarcane fields, running small shops, raising children in what they believed was a safe outpost of the Japanese Empire. As the Americans advanced, these civilians faced the same propaganda, the same fear, the same terrible choice. Japanese military officers moved among them, repeating the same messages that had been drummed into the soldiers. The Americans will rape you, torture you, kill your children in front of you. Death is the only honorable escape. American forces, aware that civilians were trapped in the north, sent interpreters forward with loudspeakers calling out in Japanese, "You will not be harmed. Come down, bring your families, we have food and water, you will be safe." Some believed them. Some came down, trembling, clutching their children, and were indeed taken to safety, given medical care, fed from the abundant American supply lines. But many did not come down. They stood at the edge of those cliffs, entire families holding hands, and they jumped. The cliffs came to be known by 2 names. Suicide Cliff, where hundreds of soldiers threw themselves off rather than surrender. And Banzai Cliff, where families leaped into the sea together. Mothers threw their babies first, then jumped after them. Fathers gathered their children, said prayers, and walked off the edge. Witnesses, American soldiers who stood helplessly on the beaches below, reported that the ocean churned with bodies for hours, that the waves ran red, that the sound of the impact echoed off the rocks like distant thunder. One Marine, a private from Ohio named Thomas, wrote in his diary, "I don't understand it, we were trying to save them. We shouted ourselves hoarse telling them they'd be safe, but they just kept jumping, whole families. I saw a woman in a blue kimono standing at the edge with 2 little kids. We were waving at her, calling to her, she bowed to us. Then she pushed the kids off and jumped after them. I can't stop seeing it. I don't think I'll ever stop seeing it." Over 12,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians died on Saipan. 3,000 American Marines and soldiers also perished in the battle. But it was the suicides, the mass self-annihilation driven not by military necessity but by ideology, that haunted everyone who witnessed it. The suicides were not spontaneous acts of despair. They were the logical conclusion of a belief system that valued honor above life, obedience above survival, collective duty above individual existence. They were the final proof that the war in the Pacific was not just a war of territory or resources, but a war of ideas about what human beings owed to each other, to their nations, and to themselves. The Americans tried to understand. Intelligence officers interviewed the survivors, searching for explanations. They learned about the education system in Japan, where children were taught from their first day of school that the emperor was a living god, that Japan's destiny was to rule Asia, that death in service to the nation was the highest achievement possible. They learned about the military indoctrination, the brutal training regimes where soldiers were beaten for the smallest infractions, where questioning orders meant execution, where every man was taught that his life belonged not to himself but to the state. They learned about the propaganda broadcasts that described Americans as subhuman monsters, about the stories of atrocities, some real, many fabricated, that convinced Japanese soldiers and civilians that capture meant a fate worse than death. But beneath all the propaganda, beneath the ideology and the indoctrination, there was something else, a profound fear of abundance. The Japanese soldiers who saw American supply depots, mountains of canned food, stacks of ammunition, tents filled with medical supplies, trucks and jeeps rolling endlessly off landing ships, were confronted with an existential challenge to everything they believed. They had been told that Japan was winning the war. They had been told that America was weak, decadent, spiritually hollow. They had been told that material wealth was a sign of moral decay, that true strength came from discipline and sacrifice. But here, undeniably, was an enemy who had both material wealth and the will to use it. An enemy who could afford to feed prisoners, to treat wounds, to offer mercy. An enemy whose abundance was not a sign of weakness, but of overwhelming, terrifying strength. For men raised in a culture where scarcity was virtue, where sharing a single rice ball among 10 soldiers was presented as noble, the sight of American Marines casually discarding half-eaten cans of fruit, of medics using clean bandages for every wound, of supply officers handing out chocolate bars as if they were worthless. This was more destabilizing than any artillery barrage. It suggested that the entire moral framework of the Japanese war effort was a lie, that their suffering had been unnecessary, that their leaders had sent them to die not for a noble cause, but for an ideology built on denial and delusion. There was one object more than any other that became the symbol of this unbridgeable gap: the K-ration. The American K-ration, a waxed cardboard box containing a meal for one soldier, included items that seemed almost fantastical to Japanese soldiers. Chocolate, cheese, crackers, cigarettes, chewing gum, instant coffee, sugar. Each ration was designed to provide 3,000 calories, more than many Japanese soldiers ate in 3 days. When the first K-rations were captured by Japanese forces early in the war, commanders ordered them destroyed. They were too demoralizing. Soldiers who saw what the enemy ate could not help but compare it to their own diet of rice mixed with weevils, seaweed soup, and occasional scraps of fish. On Saipan, after the battle, American supply officers distributed K-rations to the surviving civilians in the internment camps. Children who had never seen chocolate wept when they tasted it. Women held the small tins of cheese as if they were treasures. Men who had fought for the emperor sat silently, eating crackers, staring at nothing. One survivor, a schoolteacher named Takahashi, later wrote, "I realized then that we had been lied to about everything. Not just about the Americans, but about the war, about our chances, about what our leaders knew and what they had hidden from us. The food was the proof. An army that can give away such abundance to prisoners and civilians is not an army on the edge of defeat. It is an army that has already won and is simply waiting for the defeated to realize it." But for many, that realization came too late. The suicides on Saipan were not just individual tragedies. They were a collective revelation of what happens when ideology collides with reality and ideology refuses to yield. The people who jumped from those cliffs were not cowards. They were not weak. They were, in many cases, the bravest, most disciplined, most devoted followers of the system they had been raised in. That was the tragedy. They died believing they were doing the right thing, the honorable thing, the only thing. They died because they could not imagine a world where surrender did not mean annihilation, where defeat did not mean dishonor, where an enemy might show mercy. The American forces who witnessed the suicides were changed by them. Many struggled to reconcile what they saw with their understanding of war. They had been prepared to fight soldiers, to kill or be killed in battle. They had not been prepared to watch families destroy themselves out of fear and propaganda. Some became advocates for more aggressive psychological operations, for dropping leaflets, for using Japanese-speaking interpreters to counter the enemy's propaganda before it led to more deaths. Others simply carried the images with them for the rest of their lives, a burden of witnessing that no amount of time could erase. The fall of Saipan had immediate consequences for Japan. When news of the defeat reached Tokyo, it triggered a political crisis. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the architect of Japan's expansionist war, was forced to resign. The myth of Japanese invincibility, already badly damaged at Midway and Guadalcanal, was shattered completely. Citizens began to whisper what had been unthinkable: that Japan might lose the war, that the sacrifices of the past 3 years might have been for nothing, that their leaders had led them into a catastrophe from which there was no escape. But the war continued for another year. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the firebombing of Tokyo, the atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Each battle, each atrocity, each escalation was in some way a shadow of what happened on Saipan. The same ideology that drove soldiers to die in banzai charges and civilians to jump from cliffs would drive kamikaze pilots to crash their planes into American ships, would convince the Japanese government to arm schoolchildren with bamboo spears in preparation for a final defense of the home islands, would nearly prevent the emperor's surrender broadcast in August 1945, when fanatical officers attempted a coup to continue the war. In the end, it took 2 atomic bombs and the emperor's own voice, heard by most Japanese citizens for the first time in their lives, to break the spell. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio, announcing Japan's surrender. He spoke in the formal, archaic court language that most people could barely understand, but the message was clear. The war was over. Japan had lost. The unthinkable had happened. And in that moment, millions of people who had been prepared to die for the emperor were suddenly permitted to live. The survivors of Saipan, both the soldiers who had been captured and the civilians who had been interned, faced a long and difficult road. Many returned to Japan to find their cities destroyed, their families dead, their entire world transformed. They had to navigate the psychological whiplash of occupation, of learning to live under American rule, of confronting the gap between what they had been told about the enemy and what they experienced. Some adapted quickly, embracing the democratic reforms, the new constitution, the economic opportunities of the post-war era. Others never fully recovered, carrying with them the guilt of survival, the memory of those who had chosen death over dishonor. The cliffs of Saipan stand today as a memorial. Visitors can walk to the edges where thousands died, can look down at the ocean that received their bodies, can read the plaques in Japanese and English that commemorate the tragedy. The island itself is now part of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, a U.S. territory. The sugarcane fields have given way to resorts and tourist shops. The caves where Japanese soldiers made their last stands are tourist attractions. It is a peaceful place now, beautiful and quiet, where the only sounds are the wind and the waves and the occasional cry of seabirds. But the echoes remain. The story of Saipan is not just a story about one battle in one war. It is a story about what human beings are capable of believing and what they are capable of doing when those beliefs are challenged by reality. It is a story about the terrible power of ideology and the even greater power of mercy. It is a story about abundance and scarcity, not just of material goods but of imagination, of the ability to conceive of a world different from the one you have been taught to accept. The Japanese soldiers who chose death on Saipan were not monsters. They were men caught in a system that valued their deaths more than their lives. The civilians who jumped from the cliffs were not fools. They were people who believed the lies they had been told because they had no reason to doubt them. Because everyone they trusted had told them the same things, because the alternative, trusting the enemy, believing in mercy from devils, seemed more impossible than death itself. And the Americans who tried to save them, who shouted themselves hoarse calling for surrender, who offered food and water and safety, they were not saints. They were ordinary people from a country that, for all its flaws, had built a system where abundance was possible, where individual life had value, where mercy was not a sign of weakness but of strength. They carried that system with them in every K-ration, every chocolate bar, every clean bandage, every casual assumption that there would be enough, that survival was preferable to death, that tomorrow might be better than today. The tragedy of Saipan is that these two systems, these two ways of seeing the world, could not be reconciled in time to save 12,000 lives. The hope of Saipan is that they eventually could be reconciled, that Japan did ultimately embrace democracy and abundance, that the children of the generation that died on those cliffs grew up in a world where such a choice would never be necessary again. There is a photograph taken in the summer of 1944 of a group of Japanese children in one of the American internment camps on Saipan. They are sitting in a circle, and an American soldier, a young Marine from somewhere in the Midwest, is handing out chocolate bars. The children's faces show a mixture of fear, wonder, and tentative joy. Some are smiling, some are crying, all of them are alive. That photograph, more than any battle report or casualty figure, tells the real story of Saipan. It is a story about the moment when abundance met scarcity, when mercy met despair, when a new possibility entered the world. The cliffs of Saipan remember everything. They remember the soldiers who threw themselves off in the name of honor. They remember the families who died together rather than live in shame. They remember the Americans who stood at the bottom, calling upward, offering a different choice. And they remember that in the end, some people came down, some believed, some chose life. And from that small act of faith, from that willingness to trust in mercy rather than fear, a new world began to grow. The war did not end on Saipan, but something else did. The belief that death was the only honorable response to defeat. The soldiers who survived, who accepted capture and discovered that mercy was real, carried that knowledge with them. When the war finally ended, when the emperor spoke and the nation surrendered, there were men who remembered Saipan, who remembered the K-rations and the chocolate bars and the American medics who had saved their lives. And they told their children, and their children told their children that the enemy they had feared had turned out to be something else entirely. Not devils, not monsters, just people, people with an abundance they were willing to share. That is the legacy of Saipan, not the battle itself, which was won by firepower and courage and tragic determination on both sides. But the aftermath, the moment of contact when two civilizations met at their extremes, one built on scarcity and sacrifice, one built on abundance and individual freedom, and the choice that each person faced in that moment. To die for an idea or to live for a possibility, 12,000 chose death, but millions more in the months and years that followed chose life. And in that choice, in that willingness to imagine a different world, the real victory of the Pacific War was won. The ocean still crashes against the cliffs. The wind still blows across the volcanic rock. The sun still rises over the turquoise waters of the Philippine Sea, bringing light to the place where so many died in darkness. And on quiet mornings, if you stand at the edge and listen, you can almost hear them. The voices calling upward from the beaches below, offering water, offering safety, offering the simple, revolutionary idea that survival is not shameful, that tomorrow might bring something better than today, that even in the depths of war, mercy is possible. That is what 12,000 people died not understanding. And that is what we, who live in the world they helped create through their tragic sacrifice, must never forget.